Dear guests, welcome to our event today. This event has been organized in cooperation with many different institutes, the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Danube Institute, and the Matthias Corvinus Collegium as well. I'm Máté Szalai, the researcher at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I will moderate the event. It is my imminent pleasure to welcome Yoram Hazony to our institute. He has many titles, and I can describe him in very different ways as well. But he is the president of the Herzl Institute, and what is the most important for us is that the author of the book entitled The Virtue of Nationalism, which was selected as the Conservative Book of the Year for 2019. We have also a discussant for this event, John O'Sullivan, the president of the Danube Institute and our good partner in organization. Before I give the floor to Mr. Hazony to deliver his speech, I would like to give the floor to Márton Ugrosdi, who is the director of the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I usually don't have opening speeches for roundtable discussion, but this event is very special today because we have a world celebrity, if you want, here at the Institute, and I'm very grateful for Mr. Hazony for accepting our invitation. And I'm also grateful for our partner institutions, the Danube Institute and the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, for helping us in making this event happen today. And I'm also grateful to one of our members of our board, Mr. Jenő Megyesi, who was instrumental in organizing this meeting today. This discussion is going to be a little bit different than the usual ones we have here today, because it's not so much focused on international relations. However, it is dealing with a very interesting and important and pressing topic, if you want, and that is the future of nation states, the future of national communities, and also that how we can revive the debate which surrounds this topic. And Yoram's book, which Máté mentioned, has won the Conservative Book of the Year award last year, is a new take on the debate, and it argues that nation states are still the best forms of government that free people can have, because this is the kind of organization that can ensure the collective rights of people to rule themselves. Yoram, of course, will detail this much better than I can, because he wrote the book and he has the whole thing in his mind. But I would also like to stress that he's very well prepared to discuss this topic. He got his BA from Princeton University and he did his PhD at Rutgers. And Máté has killed many of my points because he has mentioned that Mr. Hazony is also the president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem. But still, his track record, his involvement in political thinking, his dedication to the cause of higher education in Israel, and also his international outreach is something that we're very much aware of. And for this reason, we're very grateful once again that he accepted our invitation. And basically, this is going to be me for this time, because obviously I'm not the main attraction here today, but I'm very keen to learn his views on the future of nations and how we can discuss this topic in a way which might be new, but also keep the important conservative ideas of sense of belonging, sense of community, sense of nationhood, shared history, shared culture alive in the 21st century, where many argue that these things belong to the past. Well, I'm quite sure that Yoram will show that these things do not belong to the past, they also belong to our future. And if we would like to keep our communities healthy, and if we would like to keep the conversation going, we should definitely look at books like his to understand this phenomenon. Also, his book is going to be translated into Hungarian soon, so we hope to have him back in the near future once again. Thank you very much, and I would like to pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Márton. And there's so many institutes to thank. I think I'll just thank Budapest for the invitation. No, at the beginning it's a little bit confusing because I couldn't tell them all apart, but now I'm beginning to understand. There are many institutes in Budapest, and they're all good. Is that right? All right. Well, thank you for the warm introduction. Well, some of you may have noticed that that something is happening to the political world, and everyone knows that that Brexit was a surprise in Britain. Regardless of how it turns out, it was a surprise. And President Trump was a surprise in the United States. And since then, there have been many more surprises in Eastern Europe and in Italy. And at this point, there are national conservative governments in democracies like India, Japan, Israel, around the world, Brazil. I think we're beginning to understand that this time is not a time like all times. And it used to be very well known among statesmen that the world undergoes periodic, let's say, kind of eruptions. Statesmen used to talk about the ice cap melting, the icebergs breaking down. And it's kind of a diplomatic legend. You know, every 50 years or every 100 years, there's a deep change. It's not the kind of change that's brought about by an election, because it's not a change within the politics of a single country. It's a change in the political order, you can say, of many nations or of the world. We haven't seen this kind of change since the Second World War. And we're seeing one now. And understanding what makes this time different from all other times, what makes this time special among different political times, that's the great challenge of our generation. What I tried to do in The Virtue of Nationalism is to describe as clearly as I can what that change is. I'll describe it briefly, and then we'll have a conversation about it. For those of you who are interested, I certainly recommend the book. Now, the book makes an argument that there's a limited number of ways in which the political order can be organized. Two of the main ways are an imperial order, an empire. An imperial order is one that's based on the idea that the world would be governed best if a single law, the rule of a single law could be imposed on as many nations as possible. Now, this is an ancient idea, right? This is the idea of the Roman Empire, but in the Bible we see very similar ideas among the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Persians. In fact, this is one of the simplest of political ideas. The god sends the emperor to bring peace and prosperity to the whole world. The argument is that division creates war. Division creates disagreement and warfare. War brings destruction. It brings famine and plague. Why would mankind want to waste its efforts on war and division? And so it's simple. The answer is there should be an empire. And the empire will come up with, in the name of universal justice, today we speak of a rights-based liberal order, right? An order in which there's a single law that encompasses everyone and will be enforced by someone. What's interesting is that in the West we have a very powerful alternative, because the Bible, and especially the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, are against empire. They have a completely different idea of what the fate of humanity is like. The ideal of the prophets is national freedom. There are many different nations, and each one is going to pursue God in its own way. Right? That's the vision of the prophets. The many nations of antiquity continue to exist according to the visions of the prophets until the end of time. They don't disappear. It doesn't become one world. Maybe everyone discovers God, but still each nation has its own customs, its own traditions, its own laws, its own ways. Right? This is a picture of mankind that assumes both that our human beings are too weak. Our thinking is not of a high enough quality. We're too weak in our understanding for one person or one culture or one nation to be able to come up with a law that's good for everyone on earth, as though we have the answers. We know what's right for the Nigerians and the Indians. That's the criticism. But there's a flip side to this biblical argument. The other side of the biblical argument is a positive vision. People talk a lot about diversity today. But the love of diversity in political matters, it comes from the Bible, from the idea that there are diverse nations, that God loves diverse nations, that God wants there to be many different languages and many different religions and many different ways of approaching things. In the history of the West, these two conflicting visions of world order, we can say the Roman version versus the biblical, the Jewish or the Hebraic version, the Roman and the biblical, they fight with one another throughout history. What does the world look like? What does a civilization look like without the Bible? Well, just look at the political history of Islam or the political history of China. Right? Both Islam and China have a kind of a Roman vision to unite as much as possible, everyone to whatever degree is possible, under a single law. But the Christian world didn't develop that way. The Christian world has the Bible. And sometimes the Christian world, as with the Holy Roman Empire, it admires Rome and it dreams of a Christian world empire. And sometimes the Christian tradition tilts in the direction of the Old Testament. And then it starts to think about independent nations. And that runs like a thread, this seesaw throughout Christian history. The Catholics develop in the Middle Ages, they develop independent nations, independent national states. In theory, they're still under the emperor and they're still under the Pope. But they develop these independent nations in places like Hungary and Poland and France and England. When you get to the Protestant Reformation, you get the idea of not just de facto, but de jure national independence. An explicit declaration. In 1534, the English explicitly declare, we're done. We're done with the emperor, we're done with the Pope. Now we believe in national independence. And by the Westphalia treaties in 1648, Europe is reconstructed on this idea of national independence. National independence has been the foundation of first the European political order and then the world political order for 400 years. So what's the issue? The issue is that as late as World War II, I think everyone still knew this. The Americans and the British, when they fought the Germans, they didn't fight in the name of rules-based international order. We're going to dictate the new world order instead of the Germans or instead of the Russians. They called themselves the Allied Nations. And what they promised was independence. The radio broadcasts into Europe promised the peoples of Europe, you're enslaved by foreign empires, we're going to liberate you. We're coming to liberate you, so you should be on our side in this war. And everyone understood this, I think, more or less, up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, until 1989. And in 1989, the Western nations defeated the communists, as they had defeated the fascists before that, and they stood before a tremendous decision. Were they going to withdraw and allow the world of independent nations that had been promised, or were they going to go the way of the dream, the vision of a Roman peace, like a Pax Romana, except it would be a Pax Americana. Instead of Pax Romana, Pax Americana. The world would be governed by a single law according to the values of the Americans, or maybe the Americans and the Europeans together somehow. When I first heard George H.W. Bush talk about the New World Order, right after it was 1990, 1991 that he was speaking about. When I first heard about the New World Order, I found it frightening. Chilling, that this was what was going to happen when he says New World Order. He told us, what's the New World Order about? He says, for 1,000 generations, mankind, humanity has struggled to reach this moment. This is messianic talk. It's political messianism. For 1,000 generations, mankind has struggled to reach this moment, and they failed. But I, President Bush, now I'm going to bring success. What is it that he promised? The law of the jungle is going to be replaced by the rule of law. The entire globe is going to be wrapped in a single law, which is going to emanate. In those days, they were actually talking about the United Nations, the Security Council. Later, the Americans changed it. It wasn't the Security Council. It was more the American government. The Europeans have their own views about how this works. But for a generation, all the major political parties in America and in Europe, the left and the right, Republicans, Democrats, Labor, Conservative, all the parties, the major parties, were agreed that this is the vision. We're going to bring peace and prosperity to the world by eliminating borders, by eliminating division. Right? This is a very, very old story. And for a generation, it was assumed that this is a reasonable thing to do. There were, of course, certain people who objected, but those were crackpots and lunatics. You know, the normal people all thought this is what should happen. But over the last generation, we're discovering the same thing that the prophets warned us about. I mean, it's the same old story again. We're discovering the same thing that led to the resistance of independent Catholic nations, of the Hungarians against so many invading empires over 1,000 years, and then the Protestants rebelling against universal empire. It's the same story. You cannot have a single law for all nations without oppressing someone. You cannot have a single law for all nations without oppressing many nations. Because whatever it is that the Americans or the Germans or the Russians think is right for the entire world is not going to be right for Hungary. It's not going to be right for my country, for Israel. And it's not going to be right for Britain, which is the reason that whatever troubles the British have with pulling their Brexit off for right now, in the end, they're going to reach this conclusion, because in the end, it's not going to be possible for the British to live under the control of what's in effect a foreign empire. The argument for empire is that if you apply enough force, you can bring peace. You can eliminate the disagreements. The argument for a world of independent nations is that to be human is to disagree. To be free is to disagree, to have many different views. To say we in Hungary, we want to be something different from the people in America. Let me say just one last word about tolerance, because the Universalists, as they work to extend their empire and impose it on as many nations as possible, they speak in terms of diversity. You know, we're just going to embrace everyone and then we'll be diverse. But I'm sorry, that's politically speaking, that's nonsense. When you embrace everyone, you embrace them by ironing out the diversity. You also, as you iron out the diversity, you iron out tolerance. Tolerance is not what happens when you have a single way of thinking that is supposed to be imposed on the entire world. That's not tolerance. Tolerance is when you're willing to limit yourself and say, I believe that my way is best, but I let the others do it their way. That's tolerance. And today we look at the Western world and it's frightening to watch. It's frightening to see countries that 30 years ago said, we believe in freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And today we see that freedom of speech and freedom of religion are evaporating from the most open countries in the Western world. Today there are many subjects on which you're not allowed to say this or that. You're not allowed to speak the views that you inherit from your tradition. You send your children to school and they're not allowed to say the things. I tell my children now, you can't say everything that you believe. I'm ashamed that I say that. I'm ashamed of it because I didn't grow up that way. But today the world is becoming like that. Why? Why is this happening? It comes from a mistaken understanding about imperialism and nationalism. A national order, an order of independent nations, it doesn't mean that everyone loves one another. It doesn't mean there's going to be peace. Of course, we're not all going to love one another. We'll be different from one another, and that means that some will like the others, and some will like their neighbors, and some will hate their neighbors. But an international order that recognizes the legitimacy of multiple independent centers of power is a world in which people are able at some level to understand he or she, they're different from me, they have a different view, but I can tolerate that. My view doesn't have to blot out all other views. An imperial world is something different. The universal, the imperial liberal order that many in Europe believe in and that many in America also believe in these days, that's an order in which there's only one way to think. And the stronger this imperialism becomes, this liberal imperialism, the stronger it becomes, the less tolerant it becomes, the more drunk it becomes on its own power, the more unwilling it is to allow me to say what I have to say and to allow you to say what you have to say. So people who believe in a world of freedom and competition and diversity, they're nationalists. They'll be nationalists today. And people who don't want to see that anymore, they think that time is past, they'll be liberal internationalists. And that's the struggle. That's going to be the struggle for the entire next generation. There'll be ups and downs, and all sorts of new politicians will come and go in every country, and all sorts of exciting things and scary things. But the main thing that will happen over the course of the coming decades is that this struggle is going to be fought and won or lost. Which way will we go? Towards an imperial order or to an order of independent nations? And I hope some of you will be my partners in this effort. I look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you.
Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. John O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank our colleagues at IFAT and the other partner institutions for inviting us to participate in this, and for what is, for me and for my little institute, an extremely exciting occasion. It's exciting because I met Yoram about 2 years ago when I was in the United States, and he invited me to stand in at the last minute for a speaker who had unexpectedly cancelled. Always an intimidating position to do, which I did. But what was interesting for me to that occasion was that I was addressing an audience which was concerned equally with religion and with, incidentally, the full range of Christian religions were in the room, as far as I can gather, as well as the Jewish religion. And there may have been other religions, but I wasn't aware of. But the audience was interested both in religion and in what I will call patriotism, which is to say a highly respectable form of nationalism, which I think is the only distinction I can really make between patriotism and nationalism. But it was interesting because it became clear, as it becomes clear very much so in Yoram's book, that his view of nationalism is that it tends to arise from the religions of the countries in question. It certainly has to be compatible with them at the very least, but generally the kind of nationalism that arises tends to be strongly influenced by the kind of religions that particular people adopts. Now, that particular way of thinking struck me at the time as fascinating, because obviously it was the way of thinking that our parents, grandparents, perhaps not our parents, but our grandparents and their grandparents naturally fell into. If you read the rhetoric of speeches in the 19th century and the early 20th century, if you read Churchill's speeches, if, as we discussed at dinner last night, you read Roosevelt's speeches at the beginning of the end of the 1930s and the beginning of the Second World War, they are saturated in religious and biblical references. It is not that everybody thought they were the chosen people. Of course, Christians believed that they were the successors to the chosen people, but they didn't believe that God had, so to speak, given them the Ten Commandments. I'm sometimes tempted by the idea that different nations have been given different vocations by God. But if I go too far, I probably shouldn't go too far into that. But it's certainly the case that religion as a part of the debate on politics in general and national identity in particular seems to me at least to be making something of a comeback. It has been banished in the last 20 or 30 years from respectable public debates, particularly since the end of the Cold War. But even before that, it wasn't very fashionable to talk in terms of God and in terms of the mission of nations. It wasn't very fashionable to think that our resistance to communism, and before that to Nazism, was principally religious in motivation, though for many people, particularly some of the people who perished as martyrs, self-consciously martyrs, against both regimes, it was quite, one discussed it then, but that kind of thinking has tended to go out, and it's been regarded as divisive, although I personally would argue it isn't. Now, so that's my first point. This, in Yoram's book, you will find the interpenetration of religion and politics and national identity very much clearly presented. Now, the second is that Yoram's book is, which I read with kind of enthusiasm and excitement, and which, incidentally, is one. There is a story here that it was just announced that he has won the Conservative Book of the Year award, and it's obvious. I mean, there was a strong group of contestants for that title, but one of them was an extremely good book, which in some sense, I don't think explicitly, but in some sense is on the other side of that argument. It's Jonah Goldberg's book, The Suicide of the West. And that book is not, it doesn't say nationalism is the devil, but it comes close to saying that nationalism is an obstacle. It is something drawing us back into tribalism and has to be resisted. And the fact that Yoram's book came out ahead of that game is, I think, very interesting. Even if it had been defeated by one vote, it would still have been an interesting debate. And I think we have to realize this. One of the things which struck me at the conference on migration that I attended at the weekend was several speakers, and they weren't English speaking orators, several speakers quoted Chesterton. And their quotations were to the theme of our virtues have become disconnected from the religious ideas that gave them vitality, but that also gave them restraint. And as Chantal Delsarte said, today our virtues are more dangerous than our sins, because they become a kind of wild virtues which don't accept any kind of common sense restraint on the part of those who are pushing them. And that's why I think international bodies very often are urging us to do things which by any normal standard of prudence we might not want to do. I think very few nations in the past would have adopted the idea of no borders. They would have thought it absurd, which indeed I think it is. They wouldn't have thought of the benefits of unlimited immigration. They would have thought immigration is a good thing within certain limits because it introduces new ideas and vitality and new customs and to the society. It makes it more interesting. But obviously, if you inject huge numbers of people into a particular society, you are in danger of disrupting any kind of natural harmony it might develop on its own. So I've been interested that religion has entered the debate and doing so powerfully and doing so from various directions and doing so in ways that, in a sense, threaten the concept of a post-Cold War liberal democracy that regards religion as something to be kept entirely private and not to be allowed to influence our public debate. The third point I would make, and I'll few questions of direct kind to put to Yoram, is that this is a book about political evolution. The common view of political evolution we get is that there is a natural, inevitable progress. You start, so to speak, with tribalism. From the tribes, eventually they fight, some conquer, some are conquered. They produce empires. Those empires gradually become restive because within the empire, different peoples want to pursue their peculiar genius, and they eventually emancipate themselves to become nations. Those nations become democracies. Those democracies peacefully living together, confront common problems, so they decide they will surrender their sovereign identities to larger regional groupings which can tackle global problems. And that would be kind of the narrative that leads to the European Union, but not only to that. Now, what struck me when I saw that was this, that in what sense, for these new regional groupings, by the way, are either the last gasp of history before a single world government, or they are themselves the final stage of history. What struck me when I thought about this was this, that what distinguishes those regional groupings as they surrender more sovereignty from the empires from which they evolved about 2 or 3 stages back in the historical process. Because they are, after all, different peoples with different languages, cultures, identities, and beliefs under a single government, which of its nature is a remote bureaucracy, and which finds democracy hard to manage. And the answer is, of course, that they share many of the same features, except one. The previous empires were composed of groups of they were tribes or they were nations, but they were peoples who had not yet hit historical consciousness. I mean, when the British took over large swathes of Southern Africa, they certainly met powerful tribes. But within a relatively short time, because they were the bringers of material progress and a more advanced civilization, they didn't have much difficulty in bringing those nations under their control. But quite quickly, African and Asian nations developed their own identity and consciousness and wanted to break free. That was a process, and it was completed reasonably quickly. So if that is the case, how much less stable and how much more determined will be peoples who have already reached an advanced stage of national and democratic consciousness? How much more difficult will it be to keep them inside bureaucratic structures that don't allow them to exercise their particular freedoms? I think it's going to be much harder, and that's why I think that organizations like the EU and others will either have to find some new way of accommodating national difference and democratic difference, or they're going to become ossified and crash. I know a lot of people in the audience will find this very hard to believe, but I think that that is what is going to happen. Now, the first is, how do we regard empire as you describe it versus what Samuel Huntington thinks of as the natural, not subservience, but the natural willingness to accommodate yourself in any civilization to the leading metropolitan power of that civilization. In the case of the Cold War, it was clear that America was the dominant power within the West, and everyone else accommodated to that leadership. But it was still a leadership which could be defied if necessary, except on matters of acute national security. How do we, in a sense, distinguish that, and how do we encourage the second, if it's desirable to encourage it at all? Secondly, how do we deal in the new world with the problems of a particular problem of empire that occurred in the old, which is that when you remove barriers to migration between the different provinces of the empire, people move. And in the case of, for example, the British Empire, large numbers of Indians moved to East Africa. And when East Africa became independent, their presence was resented. They were economically successful. How do we deal with the problems that in an empire, migration goes in directions which native peoples very often feel threatens their interests and identity? Fiji is the best example of that, of course. If more Europe is going to be the phrase, if more Europe is, so to speak, the manifest destiny of the European Union, and by the way, the term manifest destiny was coined by an American journalist called John O'Sullivan, who was the editor of a famous magazine. How does more Europe accommodate the different? Right, the first question really. How does more Europe work? What guarantees and what kind of safeguards can be built into a European state that at least safeguard to some degree the rights of the nations which you think are naturally at variance with it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I open up the floor for questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. And then before start to ask your question, please say your name and your institute where you belong to. I saw a back there. Let's start with.
Hello, I'm Melissa O'Sullivan with the Danube Institute. I attended a lecture a few months ago at another institution in town, and the speaker praised the concept of the borderless world. And I just remember thinking, what if China doesn't want to play this game? If the rest of us get rid of our natural defenses, which is the nation state, how do we resist an ascendant Han-dominated China? And I'm just wondering if Mr. Hazony has any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's collect a couple of more questions here in the first row.
Daniel Pipes, Middle East Forum. I read your book, enjoyed it, plan to write about it. There you very explicitly say that today's problem derives from the fact that we forgot that Germany was an imperium, and instead we decided it was nationalism. Now you said it was George H.W. Bush talking about a new world order. What was it, 1945 or 1989? And what are the implications of those differences?
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the second row.
Hello, my name is Sándor Kerekes. Sir, I am perfectly cognizant of all the protections you are enjoying being here, and welcome to Budapest. You are a guest, you are an emissary of Israel, and also enjoy the free speech. However, I can't help but finding that your ideas are practically full of holes and misconstructions and misunderstandings. I can refute almost every statement you just made. I will make do for one. For instance, the 1648 Westphalian peace broke up Europe instead of uniting it. So your claim that it made an empire or it made nation states out of anything in Europe is patently not true. And if you were correct, then all the world would be peppered with countries like communist-era Albania of Enver Hoxha, vagy present-day North Korea. That's the only outcome, reductio ad absurdum, of what you are advocating. So I submit to you that, let me mention the name of Sharon Pardo, your countryman, who wrote a book about the moral power of the European Union that holds it together and makes it work. No army, no weaponry, just the moral power. And so I submit to you that your ideas you are proposing here are pretty well toxic. They should be refuted every inch of the way, and I am willing to try it if you give me an opportunity. Nevertheless, I welcome you to Budapest.
Thank you very much. Our institute is always happy to host debates. Thank you very much. So, Yoram, I give the floor to you to answer these questions.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? Is this working? All right. Well, thank you for the warm welcome. First of all, let me emphasize that if you read the book, and maybe you don't have to buy it, maybe you can get it from the library. Right. If you read the book, then, I mean, this is obviously natural for a discussion of this kind. It's difficult in 15 or 20 minutes to stitch up all of the holes, and of course all books have holes in them. But there's an awful lot of to discuss, and you raise various good points. Let me begin with the moral power of the EU. Okay, in my view, and I understand that many here don't necessarily share my view, but in my view, the European Union is not held together by moral power. I understand that from the perspective of many of Europe's leaders, Europe is held together by moral power. But I think this is actually something of a distortion of the history. What actually united Europe to begin with was the fact that American armed forces and ongoing American military installations and American defense treaties created a space in which an external power, Russia, and also the ghosts of the Germans, German threat, I'll get to that in a second, but mainly the threat of Soviet power being faced by American force created a zone in which there was a tense unity and an internal peace created both by the external threat and by the external defender. That's what created the space in which eventually in which there was peace internally among European nations, which was eventually extended to all of Europe. Now, those conditions are gone. Those conditions they don't exist anymore. They existed for generations, but they don't exist anymore. The Americans are not going to continue unilaterally simply to be the guarantors of the peace of Europe, no matter what Europeans do. That's over. Americans can't afford it anymore. They can't afford it financially. They don't want to do it for good reasons or for bad reasons. They will not continue doing it. And the threat from Russia still exists. Maybe it's diminished, but it still exists. The question going forward is, who is actually going to take care of defending Europe? And there are two choices. One choice is to look back to the natural leadership of the Germans. I'm not talking about today, because today the Germans have no interest in military might and such things. But one option for a generation from now is to look to German leadership and allow the Germans to lead as they see fit. And we've heard quite a bit from the current German administration about what they think Europe should be like. And as Daniel pointed out in the book, I devote quite a bit of time to emphasizing the fact that unlike the Americans, the English, the French, the Dutch, the Hungarians, the Poles, unlike those peoples, the Germans have no tradition, virtually no tradition, over the last 1,000 years of an idea of a system of independent national states. The German political heritage is the defender of all of Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. As I said, there are some things about that vision that are noble, but it's crucial to understand that there is no such thing in history as a German conception of many independent nations. The German tradition is one of unifying Europe. So maybe Germany will move towards a kind of a more English form of national state. But that hasn't happened yet. Up until this point, every time the Germans put their hands on the steering wheel, what you get is pan-European empire, which is led by, or you can say controlled by, dominated by Germans. That's one option. The other option is to try to create some kind of an alliance of independent nations in Europe, which means that countries like Hungary will have to do much more to defend themselves to prepare themselves to defend themselves if they want to continue to be free. If they want to be part of Germany, a German empire, or part of a Russian empire, that's not a problem. But if Hungary wants to continue to be free, then it's going to have to make a change. And that's going to be true of many other countries in Europe.
You are operating with slippery ideas. Free, what is free? What is want to be? So, I don't want to interrupt you, but well, you have. It's not very convincing. It's not very, go ahead. Sorry. No,
it's a very important question. It's a very good question. I don't think that the subject is slippery for, as John said, it wasn't slippery for most of the last couple of thousand years, but I agree with you that right now to speak of national freedom is slippery. Why? Because after a few generations in which the universities only teach liberal political thought, and liberal political thought is based on the freedom of the individual. And I'm in favor of the freedom of the individual, but it's not the only kind of freedom that there is. When you read the Bible and you read about the Jews, the Israelites being, the Israelite slaves leaving Egypt, and they're standing at the shore of the Red Sea, and they're celebrating, they're thanking God for their freedom. Right? There are many such celebrations of freedom in the Bible and the subsequent biblical tradition. But notice that the freedom that they're celebrating is not only yesterday I was personally enslaved, but today I'm no longer enslaved. They're also celebrating a national freedom, the fact that the Israelites as a group will be able to determine for themselves as a group what their destiny is. Okay, now John Stuart Mill, probably more than any other liberal thinker, struggles to try to understand what is the substance of this collective freedom. And he uses the term cohesion, which should be taught in all political theory and law and economics courses, but it's not. So it's slippery for us. Cohesion is a description of an objective characteristic of groups of people. Sometimes it exists in a certain group, and sometimes it doesn't exist, and then there's no group. Cohesion is the mutual loyalty of me to you, or maybe not the two of us quite yet, but me to my wife, and vice versa, me to my children and vice versa, we to our neighbors. How do we know cohesion exists? Social cohesion exists if there's an attack from the outside, a threat, an attack, a challenge, then we set aside our bickering and we unite and we fight together as a single unit. That's not collectivism, because as soon as the struggle is over, then we go back to fighting, just like me and my wife. Okay, just like the brothers and sisters. Everyone goes through this. Cohesion is something that naturally exists in human groups, and it's an objective thing. You can see it. Either it exists or it doesn't exist. You can't pretend that it's the same to unite 27 different nations as it is to unite a single nation. It's objectively false. It's not true. When the group that you're trying to govern has the quality of being socially cohesive, then you can have democracy. You can have a sense of freedom. You can have individual rights. You can have people saying, you know what I love about that prime minister is that he's leading us in the right direction and he mostly leaves me alone. When you have dozens of different nations, then you're not going to have that kind of social cohesion. The only way to keep it together in the long run is by force. And that's the reason that in all of human history, we don't know of a single imperial state that developed in the direction of democracy. Democracy only exists in national states. I'll stop there.
Regarding the other questions?
You want me to keep talking? Are you serious? You want me to keep talking?
I think I'm not the only person in the room about this, but John, maybe would like to add something?
Well, I mean, in particular, the answer to Sandor's question. No, I will comment briefly on the role of Germany. The role of Germany has always been a difficult one for Europe, obviously, because on the one hand, Germany, after unification and Bismarck, was too large to be just another part of Europe. At the same time, it wasn't large enough to actually govern Europe like an empire. Had it been able to win the wars, it would still have had enormous difficulties. What is changing about the position of Germany, in addition, of course, to the Germans, who, of course, have repudiated very much a lot of what, and not just Nazism, but a lot of what went before in their history, and want, obviously, to be an important part of a new Europe, which in my view is a kind of empire in disguise. The view also of the French economics minister, who said, look, we are an empire, let's govern Europe like an empire. But what's different about the Germans is that their demographic future it looks likely that the Germans are not going to be the largest nation in Europe in 20 or 30 years. Now, they'll still be an extremely important nation, but the French and the British may be actually larger. Now, need this be a cause for anxiety? No. I mean, I think it makes it easier for the Germans to fit into a governance system in Europe in which people aren't frightened of them and don't worry about what's going to happen next, because the German national character has obviously undergone serious changes, and that itself is a kind of cause for interest and some anxiety. So I would suggest that the role of Germany is going to be very different as a result of the fact that there being simply fewer Germans, even if you include Austria in the group, in the nationality group, and that is basically hopeful for Europe in a sense, makes people less nervous, but at the same time it does mean that your idea that the Germans would lead Europe is a bit more problematic for good reasons than it might have looked, say, 20 or 30 years ago.
Thank you very much. We open up the second round of questions. I see a hand in the back of the room, in the right side. Please raise your hands again. Yes, the gentleman on the right in the back.
Thank you. I'm Barabás Balázs, journalist, and I was hoping that somebody else will ask this question, but I cannot help not asking it. You talked about the principle of one law imposed by conquerors and leaders who wished to impose and to unify countries. Also, you mentioned the term of tolerance and intolerance in such societies. How do you think that this translates to your country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to react instantly?
Could you just add a few more sentences, because I don't yet know how to answer the question.
Yes, of course. I was referring to the relationship between the State of Israel and the Palestinians. Imposing the one law on this relationship, on their status and their position in the Israeli society. They say that they are under occupation. The government of Israel say that there is a normal situation and everything is all right, and the Israeli government has every right, and the State of Israel has every right to do whatever they wish in Israel, because it is their land, and the Palestinians are supposed to accept this situation. I'm not taking the side of Palestinians, don't get me wrong, and I'm not trying to make propaganda on their side. I'm just asking what is your position on this through this filter of the one law and the idea of tolerance.
Thank you.
It's fine, don't worry, I'm not, I got it. Well taken.
Do you want to collect questions?
Sure. Well, look, Israel and its borders raises a very important challenge to the whole argument about national states. Israel is a very, very good example of a national state. It was founded by a cohesive group seeing itself as a people, as a nation. The Jews, right? The Declaration of Independence of Israel is signed by all the Jewish political parties in the territory, but it's not signed by any Arab political party. So it's really created as a Jewish state in a way that's somewhat analogous to someone who would say, well, look, there is such a thing as a Hungarian nation, and just like the Jews have a Jewish diaspora, the Hungarians have a Hungarian diaspora, and Hungarians can immigrate to Hungary the way the Jews can immigrate to Hungary. There's all sorts of parallels. Not a perfect analogy, but a pretty good one. The problem with all such states, okay, and this is true, certainly true of Israel, and it's true of all other countries, is that there is no way in practice, unless we want to be utopian, and we don't want to come up with a theory that's so pure and so unwilling to compromise with reality that it turns us into fanatics and crazy people. I mean, that's always a mistake. So if you're going to be realistic instead of utopian, then you have to recognize that one of the great problems of an order, of a political order based on national independence, is borders, right? The Romans have no problems with borders because they just don't believe in them, just like they don't believe in celebrating Independence Days because they don't believe in national independence. So they also don't believe in borders. Borders are only a problem once you get the idea of national independence stuck in your head. Then the question is, how far does each nation go? How far does its law extend, and where does it stop? And then there's a border, and somebody else's law stops. And that's always a problem. It's not solvable. It's not just that Israel has ongoing border problems with its Arab neighbors about where to draw the border. India has an ongoing problem with Pakistan about where to draw the border. The UK has an ongoing problem with Ireland about where to draw the border, which has turned into a problem with Europe over where to draw the border. Okay, so when you're weighing these things, then please accept my hearty agreement that an imperial system, such as the European Union is, one of its advantages is that border wars stop happening. I mean, that's simply the case. If you could create a single imperial state to cover the Middle East, then there would no longer be a fight between Israel and its Arab neighbors about how many Arab states should there be on Israel's borders, and where exactly should you draw the border, and so on. That would end. Okay, but also national freedom would end. So to get specifically to the issue of the Palestinian Arabs, there are one of the things that I emphasize in the book is that somebody who believes in an order of independent nations shouldn't also agree that every time that some group, some tribe, some small people demands national independence, that it can get it. Let's take India. India has within it, depending how you count, between 1,500 and 4,000 different languages. Okay, so let's take the 1,500 number. There are at least 1,500 different languages in India, and most of these are spoken by millions of people. Right? I mean, each one of these peoples has you could say that they can make a reasonable argument. We have our own language, we have our own version of a religion, sometimes it's our own religion, we have our own traditions, we have our own history. Give us independence. Now that's not possible. It's not possible to do that. There is no theoretical lower limit. Once you say every single group that has some kind of history of its own deserves national independence. So instead of having a world of independent states, you'll break the world all the way down into a pastiche of tens of thousands of little tribes all fighting each other, up until some empire comes and sweeps them all away. That's the history. So part of the theory and the art of national states is we're trying to give as much freedom as we can to as many different peoples as possible, on the one hand. On the other hand, these states have to be strong enough so that they can survive. Otherwise, what have you done? There's no big success in giving national independence to a people which is so small or so economically weak or so militarily weak or so culturally weak that within a few years they're just taken over by some neighbor. Right? That's not an achievement. The achievement is to create cohesive, strong national states, as many as is possible, that can defend themselves without destroying their neighbors. And that's the argument over the Palestinians. There are legitimate views on both sides, as you know, within Israel and abroad. There are different views about this. But the general case that we're dealing with is the case of one among many Arab peoples. Right? It's another Sunni Arab people. It's very difficult to know whether the Palestinians really should be a different state from Jordan or from Syria or from Iraq. Whether it's hard to know whether those should be different nations. And that people is economically and militarily very weak. That is, let's say Israel pulls out of the West Bank the same way that Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip. So the same thing will likely, I don't know for sure, but the same thing is likely to happen. That instead of having an independent Palestinian state, right, there'll be a democracy and bring freedom to this Arab people. Instead, they're going to be taken over by ISIS or by Iran or by the Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood. And what have you achieved? That's the argument. But the way to think about it is in terms of balance. If you believe that there should be different independent nations, understand the question of where to draw the borders is a difficult and complicated one. It doesn't mean that it's such a complicated problem that we should give up on the idea of national freedom, but it's an argument.
Thank you very much. I saw previously a hand on the left side. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. István Szabadföldi, Hungarian Republican Society. I haven't read the book, but I think that all of these arguments, and the questions and the reposts, I would say, it was quite interesting and encouraging. But, still coming one question to me: if I consider your argument of controlling the empires or the supranational organizations like the EU or the former German Roman Empire and all of the stuff. Versus the conflict resolution of nations and national interests. So let's just take one specific example, the Catalans in Spain, If you consider their arguments that they want to break free, and they want an independent state, and they feel that they have betrayed the rest of the European nations because other nations much smaller and much less GDP production, in Europe, got actually an independent nation state like the Slovaks, Slovenians, and many others. And why it is denied from them, despite the fact that they very clearly define themselves completely different than the Spanish or the French. Now, the other one in the Middle East is the issue of the Kurds. I don't want to repeat, the arguments, but and one more example. Just a few months ago, there was a gentleman here from Heritage Foundation, and then we were discussing an issue, a political issue between Hungary and Ukraine, about the Ukrainian language law. The Ukrainians lived, for 300 years under Russian occupation. They almost lost their national, identity and somehow, the cultural identity, and now they redefining themselves, and they actually impose the language law, which basically makes almost impossible for the other ethnic groups, to leave their own vertical education system, which is basically the basics of the existence of their cultural existence on the long run. So my question is, that how do you see that kind of balance, between the laws or international laws or conflict resolutions between the nations and ethnic groups versus, the imperiums. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
well, answering these questions is going to require us to solve most of the political problems in the world. It doesn't mean they're not good questions. They're wonderful questions. Look, again, let's keep our eye on the problem of utopian solutions in politics. Okay, we need to speak realistically about politics, and we often don't. And speaking realistically, there's no way to freeze any kind of particular system of borders. Since World War II, the West has been extremely hostile to changes of borders, right? And it for good reasons and for some not so good reasons, but we've moved into a kind of a strange zone in which most political discussion assumes that borders are going to be, that they can be made permanent, but it isn't actually possible. Nations grow and they shrink. They become what was once one nation can split into two, and what was a couple of different nations can unite and come together. And a realistic view of politics has to be able to take into account that these processes do occur, and the job of a realistic statesman is to try to find in each generation what are the gradual fixes and alterations that can make the system better, that can make the existing nations stronger, and that can make them more peaceable and more successful. So let's take a couple of your examples. I don't have any doubt that if it were possible for us to assist in establishing a Kurdish state, that the Middle East would be better. Not only the Kurds, I think that the entire Middle East would be better off. There we're talking about 30 million people with their own language, with their own traditions going back to the Medes, a very, very developed sense of their own identity and distinction between them and the neighboring Arabs and Turks and Iranians. And still, we don't know if it's possible to do it. All right? I mean, in other words, the theory is great, and I'm completely in favor of it. Nobody deserves an independent state more than the Kurds do, but that's not enough. The question is, can they be made to be, helped to be, do they want to be unified and helped to be strong enough so that that state can exist without being crushed? Right? I actually think it's possible, but many people disagree with me. Right? Compare that situation, and I mean that, and there you also have, also important, I think, is there is a moral issue, which is a history of, of 1,000 years of very serious persecutions, going all the way up to until today. All right, so all sorts of good reasons I would favor as a statesman, if I were a statesman, luckily I'm not, supporting trying to push a little bit in that direction. Compare that to Scotland. All right, I saw Braveheart, I saw Mel Gibson, right? And I came out and I said, wow, independent Scotland, that makes sense. Okay, but then I went to Scotland, and I was there for a few weeks. And look, and I'm not an expert. I'm not saying I actually know the answer to this question, but I'm just telling you. I went to Scotland for a few weeks, and every person that I met there, from the professors down to the restaurant owners, I made it my business to try to ask them to explain to me why after several hundred years of extremely successful condominium with the English in the UK, why they would want to separate. And you know what? I didn't hear a single good answer from anybody. And this is, I have no stake in this. I have no opinion. I'm not on one side or another. But I'm telling you that I spent weeks there, and nobody could give me an answer. The worst was that they kept saying things like, oh, we'd like to be independent of the English, but we want to stay in the EU. Which just means that to me, I didn't hear any reasons for this. So if you just are annoyed because your neighbors are stronger than you are, or more conservative than you are, or the wrong kind of Christian, but you've had a successful country for several hundred years, then I would propose that you probably just, go watch Mel Gibson movies and don't try to turn that into like an actual revolution, because not all revolutions are necessary.
Could you address China?
We actually have only 15 minutes. That's if you want to respond to that one.
Melissa, I'm sorry I didn't get back to China. I just felt like I'd spoken too long. The Chinese are kind of a riddle that I don't know that I have the fundamental answer to. In the media, they're spoken of as though they're nationalists, and in some ways, China does act like a nation, just like India, which you could also say, why is India a nation? But India is united by a strong degree of cohesion, mostly based around the Hindu heritage of the great majority of its population. And China also is developing, even though historically it was built by conquest, it is developing into something that we could also recognize as a national state. The main riddle for me with respect to China is that I don't have a clear enough sense yet of the extent to which China really is interested in control of the world system. Some of my friends, who I have no reason to doubt, see very clearly that China's role is a challenger empire, that they are clearly expansionist, not simply economically, but their goal is really to dominate the world to the extent that it's possible. Let's say that is at the very least sufficiently likely as a description of China, so that politics going forward for the next couple of generations is basically going to be about whether we can create an alliance of democratic national states which is strong enough to be able to deter threats from China, threats from Russia, and from smaller powers that might be aggressive and might be dangerous. That's the big challenge. NATO is wobbly, and you should not take this as me recommending that NATO be abandoned, but I'm saying objectively, NATO is wobbly. It's a mistake to think that it is solid. It's not solid, first because Turkey no longer shares either the interests or the values of, for example, the Americans or various Europeans. It's wobbly because it's been extended so close to Russia's cities that there is an open question whether, let's say Russia, that there's trouble on the border with Estonia. It's 85 miles from St. Petersburg. Are the Americans really going to insert tens of thousands of troops at that moment into Estonia to defend that border? I don't know. Okay, and I really don't know the answer, but the fact that I don't know the answer means that other people who are more important than me also probably don't know the answer. And that means it's wobbly. The fact that the Germans absolutely adamantly are not interested in increasing their defense expenditures to the point that they could actually be a significant deterrent to aggression, that means that the whole structure is wobbly. It's half fictitious already. Maybe it can recover, maybe it can't. But the challenge is, how can we get countries that believe in national independence, which today doesn't include Germany and doesn't include France and doesn't include Spain. Maybe tomorrow it will, I hope it will, but today it doesn't. So countries that believe in an order of independent nations, they share that value. They are self-determining democracies, so they share that basic value. How can we build an alliance that will be sufficient to deter China and Russia and smaller potential threats. Right now, the best option, and I don't know if this can be pulled off, but if I were trying to build this new defensive architecture, I would be looking to try to create a permanent alliance between America and India and Japan. The UK could be absolutely crucial to that, Australia. And then if you could get those countries into alignment, I mean, the Indians have all sorts of very good reasons for mistrusting America, which continues to treat Pakistan as an ally, even though Pakistan is no ally. But let's say you could do that. Democratic, independent, nationalist countries, you could add Greece, maybe Ethiopia, Israel is a good candidate for this. You can keep going. That could be an extremely solid defense architecture. It could include Eastern European frontline countries if all of these countries are willing to invest militarily, culturally, economically in creating an independent deterrent capacity, which right now many of them are not. Or either they're not willing or they're too scared to. If you could do that, then you could solve the Americans' problem, which is that they keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, defending the whole rest of the world, and their population is very angry about it.
Thank you, John. If you want to add something briefly.
Well, I just wanted to answer a question I asked and see what Yoram's view of it is. I asked the question, how can we move ahead in Europe in ways that preserve the democratic rights of nationalities with a general improvement in the European governments? The answer to this was given, I think, by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, in which he says free trade, I think his phrase is the free importation and free exportation of goods, would create in Europe a situation in which the different nations would be, quote, like the provinces of a great empire. Economically speaking. But there is no reason for political integration, no necessary reason for political integration to mimic economic sovereignty, to mimic economic sovereignty. It is perfectly possible to have a large free trade area in which the different countries enjoy the rights of jurisdictional competition. They elect, the borders protect the taxation system, they protect the citizenship system and so on, but economically goods could pass across the border. What happened in Europe, I think, which suggested that the EU was moving from a kind of loose confederal system to a much more tightly regulated federal one, was when the decisions were made, mainly at Maastricht, to move from a system of regulation based on mutual recognition. Each nation recognizes the legitimacy of the regulations passed by other countries, to one of regulatory harmonization, which meant that all the regulations were in a sense harmonized centrally, and then, I don't say imposed because they've been accepted by the different governments, but imposed in effect on the rest of Europe. And that creates a much more imperial structure in economic terms, and then it is, on that is built, of course, a more imperial structure in political and defense and other terms. I think that was the moment when Europe went from being one kind of political organization to another, and I wonder whether that could be reversed.
Thank you very much. As for one, I would be happy to continue to moderate this discussion, but unfortunately we don't have much more time. So thank you very much, Yoram and John, for this very interesting discussion. Thank you for the active participation. I also thank myself for the moderation, and I would like to thank our partners as well, Matthias Corvin's Collegium and the Danube Institute. Thank you very much, and see you next time.